Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Just a quick note before we get started that we're re-recording these first couple of slides because we had some minor issues with the recording on the day. The content is exactly the same as what we presented, so here it is for you to enjoy. My name is Rhys Cater. I'm the Managing Director for Precise here in the UK. And before Precise, I worked at Google, first on the ad side and later as a technical consultant for Google Analytics 360. Today, I'm joined by Andreas Arentoft, who's a senior digital advisor working here at Precise, working with some of our most sophisticated clients to implement advanced strategies. And one of those strategies is the topic of today's webinar, where we're going to dive into the subject of bidding for value. Now, what that means in practice is starting to move away from some of the established channel metrics that we're all used to. For example, revenue or purchases, as we would collect in Google or Facebook ads. Because when you really think about it, when we're using this kind of standard conversion tracking, counting revenue or purchases in the platforms, it really is a proxy for what we really think about when we talk about revenue or business value. That revenue that we see in the platforms often doesn't account for some very important factors. Returns are a great example. So what we'll talk about today is switching the metrics that we use so that what we're doing in the platforms is much more closely aligned with the reality of the business. We'll talk about the technical and strategic steps to get started with this, and we'll run through some practical examples to give you some inspiration about how you can make it happen in your business. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Andreas.
Thank you, Rhys. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we want to take you from the idea of bidding on business value to actually start doing it. And in that road, we see that a lot of marketers actually get stuck. And that is because there is some few minor kind of technical complications or mental barriers that needs to be broken down in order to continue on this road. So today, what we are really focusing on doing is trying to make it a little bit more tangible and hopefully inspire a lot of you to take the first step on this journey.
Cool. So to kick off the discussion, I think it'd be great to go into a little bit more depth about why we're here, why this is so important, because there'll be many people sitting in this webinar listening today who are using exactly the same conversion tracking methods I mentioned at the beginning of this call, standard conversion tracking in Google Ads or Facebook, where they're tracking revenue or purchases in a standard way. Those metrics have been widely adopted throughout the business. They're quite well understood. People have established lots of targets around them, and they're really ingrained. So what do we have to say to these people? Why is it so important that they actually consider a change from what they're doing and disrupting everything they have established up until now?
Yes. Generally speaking, we see there's two major reasons. One is that the marketing metrics that you usually use, such as impressions, it's clicks, revenue, of course, all these kind of metrics doesn't really capture the full value that you're getting out of your conversions. It's usually quite a short-termistic or short-term view of what is being created in terms of value. On the other side of the spectrum, we also see that a lot of costs are not really being captured as well. This includes both tangible costs, such as delivery and storage costs, but it's also more intangible costs, like opportunity cost and depreciation of future deduction in price that might occur if you don't sell products. So those are kind of the two main reasons. But if we start with the first one, which is value, and if we go to the next slide. So yeah, let's start first with the value part of it. The big discrepancy we often see is the difference in terms of bidding on short-term value versus long-term value. This can be everything from you're not acquiring, new customers. That might not be what you're ending up achieving, or other things that may be kind of not aligned with the goal you want. A good example is that we have CMOs coming to us and saying, hey, I want to maximize revenue, but not profit. And they, of course, want to do this because they want to have the biggest market share as possible and are willing to sacrifice maybe the short-term profit goals for creating long-term value. And that makes a lot of sense, but it's often not that easy to execute.
Okay, so to dive into that a little bit more, and to maybe kind of bring some of these charts that we see on the screen to life, we could imagine here that the columns that we see in the charts, columns A to E, those would be different maybe customer segments that we want to acquire with our marketing efforts. So if we have customer segment A to the far left on both charts, that's the customer segment with the highest long-term value. They might be new customers that we want to acquire that are going to go on to be loyal returning customers or customers who spend a lot of money with us. And then segment E has the lowest long-term value from a marketing perspective. So they might be an existing kind of infrequently returning customer or somebody who doesn't really need to be persuaded by marketing. And what we see on the chart on the left then is a company who hasn't really adapted their strategy to this differentiation that they have in business value. So they're not being aggressive enough when it comes to getting the most valuable customers. And then they're basically paying far too much for the kind of quick wins in the low value segment that are maybe easier to attain, but currently they're overpaying. Is that how we should think about this?
Yeah, definitely. Basically, if you have, for example, decided to yourself, like, this is how much I want to buy for, pay for customer acquisition. Well, if you do that over all your customers, have the same goal for all of them, like the really high value customers are going to be more expensive. So those that you would otherwise want to get in that kind of like segment, well, you won't be able to reach them. And similarly, you will like lose efficiency on, for the low value customers. So basically, if you were able to kind of like, adjust this so it's more aligned between value and cost, then you can actually increase your reach and actually stay at a similar spend level if, in a perfect world where all customer segments are looking the same.
Okay, so that makes sense. And if we mentioned already a couple of very quick examples of what these different segments A to E might be, do you have any, because there are lots of ways you could cut this up and build this segmentation in your account. So do you have a few more examples of what people could think about and what these segments might kind of relate to?
Yeah, definitely. So we already brought up the example of new versus returning customers. I think that's an example that is really easy for people to kind of like grasp, because everyone knows that once you have, maybe introduced your brand and like sold something to someone once, they're much more likely to come back and are generating more long-term value. It could also be, let's say you have a subscription service, you have some people who have, are going to subscribe longer. Maybe there's some people that just have a tendency of dropping off before the free trial is ending. But we also see specifically within, physical goods that is being sold, that they often have very different margins. So that could be one way you could also split the pie. The most important exercise you have to do when you're starting thinking about value is for it to be actionable, for it to be operational, for you to actually, start bidding on it. When you're creating these kind of like value buckets, they just need to be very dissimilar in terms of what is the expected value long term. You can't, just split up the pie into some pieces that you think is correct. Now, they really have to be separated. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense. We don't want to go too granular just for the sake of granularity.
Okay, and one thing you mentioned just in the last slide was the kind of the cost of goods piece, the hidden costs of what comes with selling products of those variable costs. So maybe we could dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. So if you're below it, like this graph is a little bit of a, or how can I say, graphic is perhaps a better way of explaining it, but it kind of like symbolize, a normal transaction. So how would a marketer look at it? Well, they would see that at least the revenue, that's of course something they would see, but they would also see like the ad spend, that's very common. And if they're a bit more sophisticated, they might even take like the unit cost into consideration as well when evaluating the performance. But there's so many other costs like storage cost, return rate, fulfillment cost, like all these other costs, which are maybe a little more difficult to kind of like associate with that specific transaction, but they're there. And just to give a quick example of that, let's say, for example, you have a market where the return rates are really high. Germany, for example, is notorious for having a lot of customers that would buy maybe 3 pairs of jeans and then sending 2 of them back. Well, in that case, in that specific example, well, your return on ad spend would be 3 times as high as the reality would be. So like those kind of hidden costs, they break like the increase. So that suddenly becomes quite a big problem for marketers that just keep looking at the same marketing KPIs again and again without actually understanding the real cost hidden behind the transactions.
Okay, and another example of this that we could think about would be around stock as well, which is a subject we'll return to a couple of times in this webinar. But we've had conversations with a lot of our e-commerce retailers on this topic about how to prioritize different product lines. Because one thing we often see is that it's super easy. There are certain products that really do just perform really, really well in the product lines. And in terms of getting a quick win, it can be very tempting just to throw a lot of money behind those products and kind of enjoy the easy conversion rates and good return on investment those bring. But really, we should also think about products that are struggling and might need a bit of a helping hand, right? So when we think about this chart that we have on the screen, one thing we need to consider is, well, what happens if we have a bunch of products that we can't actually sell? Those storage costs are going up. It starts to become logistically more difficult, potentially. It might even be the case that we need to sell those products at a discounted price later because we just need to get rid of them. And so if we start thinking about all of these business costs associated with stock much earlier, we can be much, much smarter when it comes to our bidding strategies, the value we're creating for the business, and how we allocate our budget and what we push and what profit we take at what point on which different types of products. So yeah, with that in mind, I hope that everyone on the call has a good sense now from what we've just described of why this stuff is important, some of the dynamics that are going on behind the scenes with the business that mean it's really important to start aligning the marketing goals more closely to what the business is trying to do. But it can be hard to know where to get started, both strategically, but also technically. So if we start with the strategy side, perhaps, I really wanted to open up this section with a question about how we prioritize the KPIs. Here at Precise, I've worked with many, many different companies, but one common theme with the people I speak to at companies, the people overseeing digital marketing, is that they've got many, many, many competing priorities. It's a really hard job. When I ask them what they want or what their business is asking of them, they have a massive list of objectives. For example, a single brand might want to be prioritizing growth, revenue, traffic, reach, impressions, all at the same time. And they're trying to do this in all of their marketing channels and looking at all of these KPIs at once and trying to balance them off against each other. So how do we tackle these conversations while also really keeping in mind that we need to keep the business value at the core of our marketing KPI decisions?
Yeah, this is an area where there's sadly not an easy answer because, and it's perhaps also one of those areas where digital marketers are struggling the most to align themselves with the rest of the business. The thing is, the marketing platform that we work with, so Google Ads, Facebook, and etc., they are all built in a way that they only optimize towards a single goal, like increase revenue, increase reach, spend this amount of money and achieve this goal. It's not, it's not one of those situations where it can balance these dynamically. So you actually need to make that hard decision.
And it is a hard decision that people have to make. So here on the screen we have 2 examples, for example, to look at. We have a company that perhaps is really prioritizing growth and taking market share, and a different example of a company who maybe wants to prioritize profitability. But when business leaders talk about all of these things being important at the same time, how do marketers actually go about picking a KPI? And do they have to pick the exact same KPI for everything they're doing if we're saying it's so important to keep this at the forefront?
Well, it's great. It's the optimal solution to always have what we call the North Star KPI, like the one KPI your business is going towards. And then the next step is then to identify those secondary KPIs that then support those goals. This becomes increasingly important when you're also dealing with like different channels, especially when those channels are very far, like if the ad interaction is very far from the actual conversion. And in those scenarios, like you do need like these proxy optimization metrics to kind of like guide your decision. But in any case, the way that you choose your North Star KPI, that is going to be a decision that you need to make. And that's going to be coming from having discussions with your investors, having discussions with your, different type of stakeholders that is, you're working with, and really having a conversation about that. And then once you have that North Star KPI, it's much easier to then build up, all the other, KPIs that kind of like support that goal, like support that one KPI, and that you can then use into your day-to-day management.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so once people have picked that North Star KPI, the next step, right, is thinking about, well, how do I actually make my marketing work around that? And I think that takes us on to our next slide pretty well.
Yeah. Well, the big thing that is usually the blocker for a lot of marketers is that maybe they have a really good discussion with the CMO and CEO and CFO and so on to kind of like define what is the North Star KPI, but then they kind of like lose the ability to actually translate that into a language that the that the algorithm understands. In general, we have two ways you can teach the algorithm who is a valuable customer for you. One is by grouping similar value similar value traffic or customer segments, and then tell the algorithm that you want to achieve a specific target for this grouping. That's kind of like you control it by setting different targets for different segments. Another way you can approach it is by changing the signals. So you can change kind of like the data that you're sending to the algorithm, whether or not it's a success or not a success. And by changing those values, we are suddenly starting to be able to give the algorithm a bit more of a sense of who our customers should be. When you're deciding on which of these approaches you might want to take, there's a couple of things to take into consideration. First is that segmenting your traffic and setting specific targets is usually a little bit easier in terms of development, but it also gives you a little less granularity. So you can't go super, specific when it comes to your value setting, because you have to be able to create these decently sized customer segments. In terms of like changing the actual values, that often requires a little bit of data engineering, or at least someone who has a good sense of automation and how to kind of like tweak things and signals into the platforms. So of course, comes with a lot more development time, but is also the most flexible of the two.
Okay, so already a couple of options in front of us, right? Changing targets in the channels or changing values that we send. So that's already a decision that people have to make, how they approach this. But as we'll see, when you really start thinking about this, there are many options for how you could get started. And sometimes we find that marketers suffer a bit of analysis paralysis, not knowing what to go for because there's just so many options. So what do you say to these people?
Well, it's all about impact versus effort. Which we are kind of trying to visualize here. So a little is better than nothing. Just doing, let's take the example of stock bidding, as we mentioned before, like doing something with your stock. That is not super complex to understand which of your products is probably going to be going out of stock in maybe 1 or 2 days. And maybe saying that, oh, those products are likely, not going to be able to bring as much long-term value, or maybe we don't have to help them on as much as other products. That is not super difficult, but incredibly impactful, because we can really reduce waste quite quickly. On the other hand, we then see a lot of, especially really big companies that hire massive data science teams to build these really complex models, but they kind of like, fail to really, materialize into a strategy because they're all simply too complex. Maybe the model that they build is only, really changing anything for 0.1% of the actual customers. And it's too detailed, too complex to actually activate. So really think a lot about like grabbing the low-hanging fruit first, and then start moving up the kind of like complexity ladder. And if you kind of like want to prioritize your decision-making process, there's a kind of like few things you should probably think about. Firstly, think about how you want to activate before you actually going full berserk and building these massive data science models. Think about how you're gonna, approach it. For example, if you want to send new values to, the algorithm, well, you need to be able to identify those signals at the time of the conversion. So that's going to limit what data can be inputted into your model. Then another key thing is also think about how much of the traffic is actually going to be affected by the model. So let's say, for example, you're only doing something different for like, let's say 1% of all of your traffic. Well, that's not really going to create the impact that you're seeking, right? The third thing that you should probably think about is what resources do you have available? Maybe you don't have a data engineer like hired already and need to bring in some more resources before you can go that road. So you might want to really take a hard look at what can you do right now with the resources you have. And then lastly, one thing that is really critical, and we mentioned a bit before, is that really try to, when you're building these models and solutions, really make sure that those segmentations and value groups that you're creating, that they are actually dissimilar. Because if they're not dissimilar, the impact of your decisions or how you're going to treat them won't actually be, that big. And if you don't really think through these things beforehand, you will run into a wall because it'll be a too big a task to tackle, and you're not going to know where to start. So start with simple models. They will most likely be the most impactful and also the quickest one to activate. And then after that, move up the kind of like what we call the maturity ladder. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. I think that's a really good framework, the effort versus reward. Really, really useful in this case where there are so many places to get started. So we've covered a bit of the theory, right? We've talked about why we need to think about these business value bidding. We've talked a bit about how we do it and how we get started and how to think about it in the business. But maybe we should think about some practical examples that could maybe bring a bit of inspiration to people in different kind of industry verticals on how they could do this and what it might look like in real life.
Sure. Yeah. So we have 3 cases for you today. We're going to start with stock bidding, which, truth be told, that's probably one of my favorite things that we have been starting working with clients on recently. And it's simply because it's so simple and so effective. The problem that we usually see with clients is that maybe they have a few missing sizes. Maybe they only have like an XX small of like a t-shirt left, but they still like keep sending traffic to that product page because, well, it used to sell well. So the algorithm doesn't pick up on this new reality where we simply have all these missing sizes. And then we see like on the opposite end of the spectrum, we see is like examples of like products that goes out of season, and those products suddenly kind of like, they should probably have been sold much earlier. So we should have nudged them much more, nudge customers to buy them much earlier. So how do we tackle that? So as a practical example, how we have approached it for many of our clients is by splitting, our shopping feeds or Facebook dynamic product ads into like different groupings with like high stock, medium stock, and low stock. And of course, not bidding on anything that doesn't have any stock. But then we kind of like group those into different categories, or segments and campaigns in our accounts. And then we simply set a different target for them. And then that will guide the algorithm and make it prioritize with ones where we are willing to accept maybe a higher ROAS and so on, and kind of like guiding its decision making without being too kind of like restrictive. The way we would deploy it, we have done it in 2 different ways. One is that we have talked to the company and actually gotten them to add it as like a custom label in the feeds. But another way where we have done it is using supplemental feeds to kind of like, build a second process for adding these new insights to the feed that we're working with.
Okay, awesome. And then, maybe let's take an entirely different example. Let's, look at B2B, entirely different kind of business objectives and dynamics, but we see similar problems in generating leads where it comes to aligning those leads with business value and understanding which leads are really the highest quality. So one typical problem that a B2B company might face is that the lead quality that they receive varies a lot. One lead might be worth $5,000, another might be worth $500,000, another might be worth absolutely nothing. So how do we kind of prioritize the high value leads with the bidding and teach our channels to do this well? Well, you don't need a complex model. You don't need predictive models or CLV to get most of the way there or to have a huge impact. You already find in B2B that when a lead is submitted, a lot of relevant data is captured with it. So things like company size, for example, might be one of the questions. So if you look at your lead forms and you have a look at a company that's 500 employees, been around for 30 years in the banking industry, you might think, well, there's a good chance this is a high quality lead. On the other hand, a 5-person startup that doesn't have an office yet and was started 3 months ago, probably not such a high value lead. So the solution here is to build some basic rules. This is pretty simple, heuristics, simple rules that we can put in place to judge whether a lead is likely to be valuable. And then the question is just how do we deploy it? How do we do it automatically? Well, it can be pretty easy. I mean, if you're running Google Tag Manager and collecting leads in your platforms, you don't even need to go as far as building kind of data automation or offline conversion uploads or anything like that. We could just use Google Tag Manager to modify the revenue of each lead coming in based on some of these rules. And that way, we're already giving our marketing channels an immediate feedback signal when the conversion happens of how valuable we estimate this lead to be, how likely it is to be good, and we're teaching and nudging the algorithm in the direction of the types of leads that we really, really want.
Yeah, and then for kind of like our last example, which is, one of those industries where we see quite advanced thinking along between our different clients within this segment, and that is for subscription services. So subscription service, like the entire business model relies on long-term value. So that's why it's often more natural for them to start having these conversations early on. But one thing that, like the biggest issue that subscription service are dealing with is short-term subscribers. Like you paid a lot of money acquiring your customers, and then they leave quickly, or maybe that you have a free trial and they're actually dropping off before they pay you anything. So that's a huge hole that really, really can drain your marketing efficiency. So the way that we have approached it with some of our more complex clients, and this, I will have to say, this is a complex way of approaching it, but that is by looking at post-subscription activity. So what are they doing on site? What pages are they visiting? Let's say, for example, you have a fruit box company that is selling, like you send every week, you get a fruit box. Are these people going in and actually changing their order? Well, then they might be losing engagement with your product, and then they might unsubscribe early. Or maybe they just change all the products every single time. Well, that's another example of a behavior might indicate that they're just dissatisfied with the product. In any case, there is these kind of behaviors that happens just after subscription that can guide us in terms of how valuable will this person be, let's say 2 years down the road. And in those instances, we can actually take those signals and build quite complex CLV models that we can then, recalculate that value and then send that signal back using offline conversion uploads, because you can actually change the conversion values that we've been sending to the platforms after the fact. So it's a very cool example of how you can take this from simple rules as we did in the stock solution, and then having these complex and really sophisticated models that we are explaining here in this subscription example.
Cool. So 3 very different, but hopefully very good examples to give people a really practical sense of what we're talking about. And that, of course, is the end of the examples. So now that we've covered all this material, just to wrap it up, Andreas, if we could say to people, a few last words of advice for how they can go away and think about this kind of tomorrow. What would you tell everyone?
Yes, of course. We have 3 tips for you. First, something is better than nothing. Just get going. Like, this is gonna be a journey for you, and it's not gonna be, easy if you're trying to, build these complex solutions from day one. Start by just looking at what is impactful for you, and then go for it. Second is, the low-hanging fruits are usually the most impactful. Like, the 80-20 rule is insanely good when it comes to the insanely guiding when it comes to how you should approach this. And then lastly, and this is one thing that at least marketers tend to kind of neglect, and that is ask your organization. Like, some of the best ideas and best marketing strategies that I've been able to come up with clients have not come from sitting down with a bunch of marketers, but having talked to the business leaders in other areas, such as supply chain, could be the CFO, like all these, different parts of the organization that has a different understanding of like how to drive value. Those ideas are really valuable when you really want to drive business values rather than just like optimizing marketing performance. So like looking at these, you might say, okay, that's great. But what about tomorrow? A little bit slow screen. So if you were to make a decision on what to do tomorrow when you sit down in front of your computer and want to make impact, well, try to identify like parts of your account that can be segmented and have a different expected value. And that would be then you then segment that traffic and then set a more relevant target for that specific group. This 9 out of 10 times, you probably already know what that customer separation is, but in a lot of cases, you just need to go in and actually do it. So that's something that you could do already tomorrow. And in 1 month's time, you should sit down and actually take a look at where are your hidden costs. Where is the inefficiencies in your supply chain? Maybe you have different delivery costs for different markets. Maybe return rate is different for specific product categories. And like really take a look at your business. And as we mentioned before, talk to your organization, like really, get all the help you can to identify these hidden costs. And then lastly, like 1 year from now, what should you have done in 1 year? Well, no one is going to say that this is going to be an easy road, and you aren't going to need specific resources. You're going to need some solid data engineers, or at least one to kind of guide you. But you also need to have sat down with all the stakeholders and defined your North Star KPIs, so you really understand how to go about going for that business value. And then once you have those 2 things built in the foundation, you then go and take the leap and actually start building the infrastructure and data flows that allows you to activate the data dynamically, or really building a solution and strategy that really create long-term value rather than just maximizing your short-term marketing KPIs.
Awesome, cool. So I think we've made it to the end of the material. We have 1 or 2 questions that we'll run through. And if anyone has any thoughts and questions that they'd like to ask, having run through this material, please feel free to add them in the Q&A right now. You have a minute to do so, because I'm going to take this opportunity to plug our next webinar that will be on the 25th of March, where we'll be getting our analytics experts here to talk about how to get the most out of data. So that's not talking about using it for value bidding like today, but really talking about how to visualize it and make it accessible to the organization in a way that makes sense. We talk a lot about democratizing data and making it make sense and making it clear, making it accessible, but also how to do that at scale and to do it efficiently in a world where data volumes and data complexity is going up and up and up and up, and really a spreadsheet won't cut it. So that's coming up the 25th. So please do sign up if you'd like to join us. And I would also recommend checking out our blog. There's a lot of relevant content there. Example is today we talked a lot about using data and bidding on value, segmenting customers, but we didn't really touch at all on privacy, which is obviously a hugely relevant topic to make sure we do this in the right way. And then there's many other topics there as well that could be relevant for people to take a look at that'll be related. But I think now it's question time, and Andreas, you'll be delighted to know that I'll be asking the questions and you'll be answering them. So the first one we had was, how do we evaluate the effects of what we're talking about today, given that you can't really do A/B tests on a change like altering your bidding to be on CLV or profit? How do we prove it's actually working?
That's a really good question. So how we, for example, we're working right now with a client where we want to take them on this journey, but we are very early on. So the step that we are kind of like started with doing is simply setting up a method for tracking kind of like how is the situation right now to understand what is the baseline. So we built a dashboard that tracks returning and new customer acquisition via our paid search activity. So that will allow us to kind of like get an understanding of like where we're going right now. And that is going to serve as kind of like the baseline for what we're evaluating later on. So we definitely need to kind of like have before after analysis, but it's trying to capture those kind of like what are you trying to achieve? And let's say, for example, you want to prioritize specific high value like high profit product categories. Well, in the same way, you could start with keeping track of, how much of your sales goes to that category. And then like 1 year down the road, how much of it is then later. So you kind of like, again, get an understanding of like, are you able to kind of like change the basket, like change what is, who are your customers, also change like these metrics. So yes, it's very hard to see the like whether or not the kind of like the succinct like A/B test, like very clear value you're creating, but you can look at the relative share that those value segments are taking of the entire bundle.
Awesome. Hopefully that is helpful. Thank you to whoever asked the question. I didn't have the name in front of me, sorry. We have another question here in the chat, which is that a lot of brands communicate their North Star KPIs as revenue and ROAS. So can we talk a little bit about how we'd achieve both at the same time for those businesses that really want both and aren't willing to compromise?
Well, but yeah, of course, when it comes to something having a goal as ROAS and revenue, as we kind of like tried to hint at before, those are probably not your ideal KPIs to begin with. Revenue is kind of like a proxy for growth, but in reality, what you want to do is probably something more akin to new customer acquisition. So yeah, so when you're talking about like kind of trying to achieve both, it will have to be kind of like a balancing act. How we usually do with our clients is kind of like setting this is the ROAS we want to like at least achieve, and then maximize revenue from that. If you, for example, want to increase your ROAS target, we then kind of like usually indicate to them what would be the trade-off, and have actually started building some kind of forecasting tools that allow us to actually showcase this kind of like what is the trade-off. And that's usually how we are, talking to them about it, like really showcasing what happens if we move things around. But as like the groundwork is to challenge them on that, the perception of like revenue as the thing that we're trying to achieve. Well, it's potentially either growth or profit. That is usually, the two camps you should land in, and revenue is a little bit more of a proxy metrics for that.
Similar with ROAS, right? Just on the topic of brands that have revenue and ROAS as the center, there's a lot to unpack in ROAS already. Like we discussed before, the ROAS that you see in the platforms is often itself a proxy. So if you are talking about ROAS, it's really important to get yourself even closer to what ROAS really means for your business, which, does it mean profitability? And if that's what it means, then you need to be thinking about all the stuff we talked about today, right? Like, what margin are you taking on your products? What stock do you have? What's your return rate? Like all of these different things, you need to think about them to like properly get to a ROAS that's kind of like reasonable for you to hit your business goals. So I think that's like, I definitely recommend like unpacking ROAS as well.
Yeah, and just like quickly on that one, one thing that we also really see is important when you're talking about ROAS, because that's like one of those marketing KPIs. So the CMO might be really happy to hear about, oh, this is the ROAS we achieved, but people in the supply chain and so on, they might have different kind of like understanding of it. So I think that the best way to kind of like trying to challenge these things is like breaking down some of these silos that is created within organizations, and really have a more like broader conversation about these KPIs, and trying to really come to the bottom of what are we trying to achieve, and then find that unified goal. That's kind of like the process that we see as the most rewarding in terms of like getting to the right place in terms of bidding on business value and not just marketing goals.
Cool. We have one or two more questions. I mean, I know we've just about hit time, so we're happy to sit here and answer a few more questions for a little bit more time. But other people, may have things to get to. So if you are, ready to jump out, I just wanted to say a big thanks for joining and for listening today. Like I said, we'll sit here and answer just a couple more questions, because there's some really good ones rolling in. But do feel free to leave if you need to get to your next thing. So yeah, we'll touch on these couple other questions for those who do want to stay and listen. So the question that just came in was, what approach do you suggest to use for CLV and churn rate calculations? It's quite a big topic.
That is a quite big topic, and it will be dependent. One thing that is the most neglected when you're talking about CLV is actually that there's an increased risk as times go by. So like for investments, you have to kind of like take that into consideration and start thinking about how are you discounting this future cash flow that you expect to receive. So that is one thing, like, adding a little bit of a discount rate to your CLV model. That is, one of those things that we really have to kind of like take into consideration. And it's usually the one that is forgotten the most. But like when we're trying to kind of like do these CLV models, what we are usually trying to achieve is just kind of like looking at the data and seeing what is then the rate of drop off. And that will usually have like after a month, it may be like 50%, after 2 months, it might be just 10% and so on. And then trying to build a model based on that data that we can then apply to the entire kind of like sample of users. And that is then used to calculate our CLVs. But in terms of what
really
is more
tricky, right?
Yeah, it's very tricky, yes.
With CLV, because also, you can calculate what you expect a lifetime value to be for a user in a more or less sophisticated way, but you can't assume necessarily that you're never ever going to pay for that user again in marketing channels. So if you say, well, I'm willing to acquire to pay X to acquire a user, well, you've got to bear in mind that you may well be paying again further down the line for them to come back someday. So that ongoing analysis of what you're paying for new and returning subscribers is also, I say subscribers, sorry, customers, is also like a really, really important, because that's relevant for any industry, really, really important to keep in mind. And speaking of new and returning customers, I am gonna jump on to the final question. Well, there's a couple of questions, one just appeared in the chat, but first one's first. It's about new and returning customers, which is, how would we actually do it? Would we do it through a customer match list import in Google Ads? This question relates to Google Ads. This person says, I'm not a big fan of that because it's a manual job and would love to hear how you approach it in an automated way. And we probably won't be able to go into details now beyond just saying it is possible to automate this, right?
Yeah. So yes, that is one approach. If you also are a little more specific, is, for example, with smart shopping, we are also seeing that there's this new customer like value bidding that is now a new feature there. In general, the solution does seem to be not as sophisticated, not as close to real value. So yeah, I do agree that they are not great. So we would probably want to either, use data from Google Analytics and etc. to kind of like, recalculate the value and then use an offline conversion upload to kind of like, reset the value. Or we would, if it is possible to estimate it at the time of conversion, maybe, for example, you are a fashion retailer and at the time of conversion, the user have to type in like an email address. Well, that would indicate whether or not they are new or returning customer, and we can then use that data to then tweak the value. So at the time of conversion, we can maybe also like, identify whether or not this user is more valuable or, or less valuable. But just like one thing when it comes to this is like, it is about just doing something. Like a little bit is better than nothing, as we kept repeating. So just doing something quite simple as like all new customers are valued 20% more than their revenue. And then that would very simply be tweaking things and making progress. It might not be perfect 100% of the time, but it's definitely like better than doing nothing.
Cool. Loads of interest in this topic of how to actually get this stuff in the platforms, and we're going to finish with this last question now. If anyone has any more, we won't be able to address them today, but do feel free to send them through to us separately. We're always really up for chatting about this stuff. But this final question is, how do we usually upload CLV or profit data to Google Ads? This person has said that if we do it with the normal conversion pixel, we expose margins or LTV calculations on the website because people can kind of see the information that's being sent from the browser through to something like Google Ads. And then they've said that the conversion upload API is not very good from what they can tell. Maybe I could kick off this answer just by saying that, I think we've had a lot of success with the conversion upload APIs in Google Ads. So basically uploading conversions using Gclid values, click ID values, basically mapped to conversion values. It does take a little bit of work to get it set up, but once it's set up, it can be quite robust in our experience. And the other thing that's really relevant to mention here is server-side Google Tag Manager. It's a new feature for Google Tag Manager. I'd almost go as far as say a new product, I guess, from Google, which allows you to move a lot of your data collection from the browser, where everything's happening in the browser, to be sent through to Google or to Facebook, moving towards a model where you can actually send things to your server, do things there, manipulate the data to be sent, and then send it on to Google or Facebook, and that all happens on the server side, so it's kind of invisible to the user. So if you want to keep competitive information confidential, that would be a really good way of doing it. I don't know if you have anything to add to that one, Andreas, but
no, that was really good. We do also see quite a good usage of Google Cloud to help us with some of these things, and have built some kind of profit solutions where we are actually storing all these like sensitive information somewhere else, like in a cloud bucket, and then are using API endpoints to access that information, and without having all these calculations happening in the browser, then sending conversion signals after the fact. So that's one way that we have also approached it, and one of the reasons why we have been investing quite heavily in upskilling within Google Cloud services in general.
Awesome. And with that, we will wrap it up. I see we've got quite a few people who've stuck with us right until the very end. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you everyone for attending. It's been really fun talking about this topic. A big thanks to Andreas as well for all the knowledge he shared with us today. And yeah, thanks for attending, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.